So one of the questions last week was from Lucy. It was a question about what can, in a way, what Buddhist teachings can help us. How do Buddhist teachings help us be moral beings in society? That was the question. I've slightly paraphrased it, but so that's a really, in a way, that's a really good question. In a way, the reason I chose to go with that tonight is because it's, in a sense, that cuts to the heart of why Dr. Ambedkar is a significant figure in the history of Buddhism, because that was his sort of primary concern. That was his big interest, his big question. So, as I said a little bit before we started meditating, one of the ways he answered that question, one of his recurring images he used was this phrase: liberty, equality, fraternity. So what I'm going to do this evening is just unpack a little bit why he used that phrase, what I think he meant by it, and then ping you off into your little breakout groups to talk a bit about how we can think about it here and now. So yeah. So what I'm just gonna read you a relatively long quote. So don't worry too much. But I thought it'd be nice to hear what he himself had to say. So this quote, it's from a relatively early piece of his writing, actually, where he's, well, I'll let the quote talk for itself, and then I'll tell you a bit about it. So he starts, he says, "What is your ideal society? If you do not want caste, it is a question that is bound to be asked of you." So caste here we can read in a way, say, yeah. Anyway, I'm just going to read it to you, actually. I'm not going to commentate, so I'll just read it. "If you ask me, my ideal society would be based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. And why not? What objection can there be to fraternity? I cannot imagine any. An ideal society should be mobile, should be full of interest channels for conveying a change taking place in one part to other parts. In an ideal society, there should be many interests consciously communicated and shared. There should be varied and free points of contact with other modes of association. In other words, there must be social endosmosis, which means kind of fluidity, change. This is a fraternity which is only fraternity, which is only another name for democracy. Democracy is not merely a form of government, it is primarily a mode of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. It is essentially an attitude of respect and reverence towards one's fellow humans." So that last sentence is the key bit. It's essentially an attitude of respect and reverence towards one's fellow human beings. Any objection to liberty? Few object to liberty in the sense of a right of free movement, in the sense of a right to life and limb. There is no objection to liberty in the sense of a right to property, tools, and materials as being necessary for earning a living, to keep the body in a due state of health. Why not allow a person the liberty to benefit from an effective and competent use of a person's powers? The supporters of caste, who would allow liberty in the sense of a right to life, limb, and property, would not readily consent to liberty in this sense, inasmuch as it involves liberty to choose one's profession. But to object to this kind of liberty is to perpetuate slavery. For slavery does not mean merely a legalized form of subjection. It means the state of society in which some men are forced to accept from others the purpose which control their conduct. Read that again. In which some men are forced to accept from others for purposes which control their conduct. This condition obtains even where there is no slavery in the legal sense. It is found where, as in the caste system, some persons are compelled to carry on certain prescribed callings which are not of their choice. Any objection to equality? This has obviously been the most contentious part of the slogan of the French Revolution. The objections to equality may be sound, and one may have to admit that all men are not equal. But what of that? Equality may be a fiction, but nonetheless one must accept it as the governing principle. A person's capacity is dependent upon 1, physical hereditary, 2, social inheritance or endowment in the form of parental care, education, accumulation of scientific knowledge, everything which enables them to be more efficient than the savage, and finally, one's own efforts. In all these 3 respects, humanity is undoubtedly unequal. But the question is, shall we treat them as unequal because they are unequal? This is a question which the opponents of equality must answer. From the standpoint of the individualist, it may be just to treat people unequally as far as their efforts are unequal. It may be desirable to give as much incentive as possible to the full development of everyone's powers. But what would happen if a person were treated unequally as they are unequal in the first 2 respects? It is obvious that those individuals also in whose favor there is birth, education, family name, business connections, and inherited wealth would be selected in the race. But selection under such circumstances would not be the selection of the able, it would be the selection of the privileged. The reason, therefore, which requires that in the 3rd respect of those described in the paragraph above, we should treat people unequally, demands in that in the first 2 respects, we should treat people as equally as possible. Phew, that was a bit of a tongue twister, wasn't it? So let's just break that down a little bit. So there's a few things to say here. First of all, anyway, he's one of the characters, Dr. Ambedkar, is he has this slightly confrontational style. So rather than saying this is a good thing because, he says, if you think that's a bad thing, this is why it isn't a bad thing. So he's got, I suppose partly because he was often writing and communicating in views in opposition, basically, because he was challenging for mainstream society. So he often took that kind of tone or style. And yeah, I suppose that's just how he communicated. But let's try and break down these 3. So liberty, equality, and fraternity. I'll just I'll put them hopefully in a more accessible language or more understandable, because particularly that equality thing at the end, it gets very legalistic, and I've read it several times today, and I've got it in front of me, and I'm thinking, God, what the hell is he saying here? So if you found that a bit confusing, I will forgive you. So really what he's saying is a wait, I want to just back up a second. Of course, the important thing to remember is that he's saying this over 100 years ago. It's 1935, so 85 years ago. So we might just be thinking, yeah, that's obvious. But in some ways, it's important to remember that as a historical writer, sometimes things which we consider obvious is because the battle has been won, or the battle at least has been acknowledged, and actually that was a significant thing. So what he's saying is equality. The reason he places so much emphasis on equality is the objective acknowledgement that people really aren't equal. Like obviously he uses that phrase in there, doesn't he? He talks about privilege, which of course is a very live social political issue in our world today. So he's just recognizing that. He's saying, look, people are not equal. Don't don't that's just the case. If you're rich, if you're well connected, if you're smart, if you come from a good family, you will have an easier time getting money and power and success in this life. That is just simply true. But in a way, what he's saying is, and this is of course the important point, is he's saying that you cannot if you base your society on that, then all you'll get is the rich will carry on richer and the poor will carry on getting poorer, which of course is very well, that's just obviously true, isn't it? What you do about that is much more complicated. So when he's talking about equality, what he's really his core point is that and I'll say a bit more about this in a second. His core point is that because he's talking constitutionally as well here. He's saying you need a constitution which people are equal, because there are so many ways in which people are not equal. So we need some way of raising equality, and that needs to be consciously done. You can't just wait because people aren't equal, basically. And I'm going to jump on now to what I think is, in a way, one of the most important or interesting things he says, or thing I find really moving. So he talks about liberty. So if so I've got two things to say here, both of which I mentioned last week, but I just want to kind of give it a bit more airtime because I think it's really important. So when he talks about liberty, of course, his primary battle, as it were, was to support people, illiterate, uneducated people who were forced into very specific crap careers, who weren't allowed to marry who they wanted, weren't allowed to live where they wanted, were actively prevented from accessing education and religion and the acquisition of wealth on the basis of their caste. So he's saying, so his primary concern is to help people access kind of socio-economic mobility, basically saying, you know, you can go where you want, you can live where you want. He used to say to his people, obviously, when he was teaching, India was primarily a village society. He said to his people, go to the cities, because in the cities, people don't know who you are. You can reinvent yourself. You can lead a new life. You won't be treated. You won't be so readily treated on the basis of, you know, what your father, what your grandfather, what your great-grandfather did. It's not quite as easy as that in Indian society. There's people's names are a very, very strong indicator of their caste. So we've got it a little bit, don't we? I'm sure most of you are UK citizens, but I'm sure whatever culture you come from, you know, you meet somebody and they say their name, or you read somebody's name and you're already starting to form a judgment, at least sometimes based on their name. It's more complicated now, isn't it? But I suppose, yeah, for an example, it has changed. But when I was a kid growing up, if somebody had a double barrel name, for example, that was a fairly reliable indicator of their socioeconomic class. For Magda's sake, they were rich, basically. That meant, you know, if somebody's got a double barrel name, that means they're rich, or they used to be rich. It's not like that anymore, of course. Or if you meet, yeah, particular, but in India, it's very, very strong association. If you've got this surname, that tells you exactly what caste they're from. Very, very strong kind of, yeah, kind of fixing. Anyway, gone off on a little bit of a tangent there. So, but what I really love about Dr. Ambedkar's teaching, or he makes something which is present in Buddhism much more explicit, is he talks about what liberty is really about is the fact that every human being has got unlimited potential. That's his in a way, that's his vision of what liberty is. And I think I said this last week as well, but just to re-emphasize it, one of the amazing things about Dr. Ambedkar is so when he converted to Buddhism and he chose Buddhism as the religion he encouraged his followers to follow, and of course it wasn't an obligation, he like, they were illiterate, and he chose objectively the hardest religion to practice on earth. Like, Buddhism's really hard, you know, like it's hard because it says you can take responsibility for your own mind and you can change your own life. It's much harder than praying to than a theistic religion which is based upon prayer and praying to somebody else to sort your life out for you. Not meaning to, that's a simplistic and disrespectful take on theistic religions, but there's some truth to it. So he's really saying, he's saying to these poor illiterate people, he's saying, you have got limitless potential. You have got the capacity to totally transform your mind and totally transform your life. That's, yeah, like, in a way, that's an incredible vote of confidence. If you just imagine that, yeah, there you are having this really crap life, and somebody says you have got limitless potential, you can achieve anything. And in a way, that's one of the things that you can see from that, like, one of the consequences of Ambedkarite Buddhism is this vast growth and confidence, the sense of capacity and opportunity and potential. Really, really remarkable. I was going to go off into another aside there, but I feel like I'm doing too many asides, so we'll save that one for another day. So yeah, so liberty, so you've got equality as this equality is a recognition that we need to have a principle, we need to principially treat people as equal because they're not. And then he's saying, and liberty is the basis of that equality. So he's not saying, he's saying the reason or the vision behind equality is the fact that we've all got the same limitless potential. And that's what, so sorry if I'm a bit rambly, that's what I find really beautiful is this, what's it like to relate to people on that basis? We've all got a limitless human potential. So in a way, I find that really interesting because of course it's really easy to relate to people on anything but that basis, isn't it? We relate to people on the basis of their gender, of their nationality, of their race, of their age, of the job they do, of whether we like the look of them, whether we find them attractive or not. We relate to people on all these different bases, however whatever the plural of that is. But what would it be like to relate to people on the basis that they've got limitless potential? So that's, in a way, Lucy's question was the kind of question of how can Buddhist teachings help us to be more moral members of society? In a way, one of the key things that Dr. Ambedkar is saying is it to have a big vision which guides our behavior, that guides our activity. I found it very striking, that quote I read to you, that his first question was, what is your basis of an ideal society? I find that very interesting, that that's where he starts in his sort of conversation about how to organize society, how to run society. He says, well, the first thing you need to work out is what are you going for? What's important to you? What is the yeah, what's the ideal here? Because if we don't have an uh, because the ideal governs our behavior, basically. So that brings us round to fraternity, which is his, if you remember in that quote he starts with, and again he says this interesting thing. He says that he correlates fraternity with democracy. So this is him, whether or not he's successful, he's trying to redefine, excuse me, he's trying to broaden his definition of democracy to one of well, like a vision of a vision of a civil society, a vision. So democracy isn't just the idea that we vote occasionally and theoretically the people we vote for do something useful and represent our views and values. It's like his vision of democracy is a society which is sensitive and alive to each other, to people. So that's why he uses fraternity. In his later writing, he goes further and he uses the word Maitri, which is like we're doing the metta bhavana earlier. So metta is this very ancient Buddhist word for loving kindness, and Maitri is the sort of what that word's come to. That's the word in modern Indian languages, kind of like a spirit of friendship, openness, connection. And again, I mentioned this last week. He's in a way he's saying, well, uh, that sense of common humanity has to be the basis of our kind of our government, of our social relationships, because otherwise it's just rules, it's imposed. It's not based on feeling, I suppose. So I've tried to kind of give you a bit of a picture of his these three terms: liberty, equality, and fraternity. And yeah, the tricky thing is that, like, practically speaking, he practically he was a big vision man. So he's like, okay, here's a vision, uh, and you can live into that vision. If you've got a big enough vision, you can kind of manifest it. You can bring it into your life. Uh, he wasn't. He was really clear that there were practical things you could do. You based your behavior upon your. In a way, he was a practical idealist or something like that. So he's like, have a big vision and then let your behavior, your actions, your choices be informed by that vision. Um, So that's a bit where we think, well, that's a bit more complicated from that, but he, in a way, that I suppose you can't do everything, can you? So that was how that's the way he taught. Those of you who've done our intro courses will know that we, the kind of, my mind's just blanking, the ways of living your life course, whatever we call that. Sorry, I've designed this course and written it. I can't remember what we call it. We talk about the kind of 5 ethical principles of kindness, of generosity, of contentment, of honesty. So those are in a way, that's Buddhism's way of trying to chunk that down into practical things. Okay, so like asking yourself, well, how can I be more kind? How can I be more generous? How can I not behave in ways which aren't kind, which aren't generous? So that's, you remember me telling you that story last week at the end about the little boy who showed up at his house. So that's a real example of him acting, not just talking about treating people equally or treating people like they've got potential, but really living that out in his behavior, kind of taking the time to do that. So I'm just about to stop, but I want to kind of finish what I've got to say here. So one of the things I find interesting about this, so we've got this liberty, equality, and fraternity. So you may or may not have realized by now, Buddhism does loads and loads of lists. It loves lists. And one of the fun things you can do with multiple lists is you can play with correlating them, kind of see how they fit together. So one of the key lists of Buddhism, because Dr. Ambedkar asked this question of like, how do you go about getting an ideal society? So kind of mainstream Buddhism, or kind of pure Buddhism, as it were, talks about the 3 jewels. You'll remember this from our intro course as well. So it talks about the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And I think there's a one-to-one correlation between the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha and liberty, equality, and fraternity. So, so just to draw that out for you, so you've got the Buddha as a kind of the ideal of awakening human potential. Well, of course, that's liberty, because what liberty is, what the Buddha represents is the limitless human potential of all living beings. So then you've got fraternity, and he talks about that as a quality of communication of society which is genuinely open and unfolding and sensitive to each other. So I think that correlates directly with Sangha. So then we're left with equality and Dharma, and in a way, well, you could say that the Dharma is a path of teaching, as a method of realizing the truth. And in a way, well, it's this relating to people on the basis of equality, letting that being the behavioral principle by which you live your life, which allows you to move towards liberty. That's a bit more dodgy, that correlation, but I haven't quite got it together there, but I think you can make a reasonable correlation there that equality, well, in a way, you could say that equality is a principle or a practice which helps you to access liberty. By treating other people as equal, you deepen and with a sense of connection to them. That's actually the way in which you realize your potential, at least one way of realizing it. So I'm just going to finish with a little story, because I like telling you little stories. So one day, at some point, this is years before Dr. Ambedkar kind of formally got into Buddhism, he was doing this radio interview, and he rocked up, and as for those of you who aren't familiar with Indian culture, one of the very traditional greetings when you meet somebody is you say namaste, which means I salute you. So the radio interviewer says namaste, and Dr. Ambedkar said, "Oh, I don't like saying that." And the interviewer was like, "That's weird. That's what everybody says. Why not?" And he said, and he went on to say, "Well, namaste it's based upon this caste system. It's saying I am better than you. You are, like it builds into this sort of this like who's kind of social superiority, inferiority thing. I like saying Om Mani Padme Hung. Om Mani Padme Hung being a famous Buddhist mantra, probably the most famous one. And the interviewer's like, "Oh yeah, why do you say that? And what's all that about?" And they go on to have this kind of like, basically the whole radio interview is Dr. Ambedkar talking about why he likes saying that and what it means to him. But the short version is Om Mani Padme Hung means something like, I bow to the universal from the universal potential within me, I bow to the universal potential within you. That's how he chose to frame it anyway. You can have an argument about exactly what that means. But it's Om Mani Padme Hung, it means something like the jewel in the lotus, so the limitless potential of the human consciousness. And yeah, that was decades before he formally converted to Buddhism. So it's why am I telling you that story? Because it kind of evokes something about this. Well, it's just this sort of like when you're saying hello to people, just saying hello to people in this bit of like, oh, I've got limitless potential, you've got limitless potential. Can we relate to each other on that basis? And making that, in a way, this is one of the practical things coming back to Lucy's question. It's like, it's these little ways of making that conscious in your mind. It's like these little kind of reminders of every time you say hello to somebody, you're saying, oh yeah, I can grow and you can grow. That's what he's saying there. So that's enough from me. Let's ping off into little groups. So your questions, you've got a couple of questions. So I've talked about these kind of principles, I suppose. So the principle of liberty, limitless potential, the principle of equality, of relating, of limitless. So here's the thing I've got there finally. So liberty is not just your liberty. It's not just you've got limitless potential. Equality is saying we've all got limitless potential. Got there finally, thank goodness. And fraternity is saying, and then what is it like to relate to people on the basis of our shared limitless potential? So those three principles, limitless potential, relating on that, and then relating to others on that basis, and then that giving rise to a deeper, more satisfying experience of relationship. Which of those do you find most interesting, most intriguing, most appealing? You can spin that into Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha if you like. So that's one question. Which of those do you find most appealing? And then the second question, and this is a much harder one, so I'll let you off if you find it difficult to answer, is how can you think of some ways in which you can apply those principles in your actual daily life? So I just told you that example of Dr. Ambedkar saying Om Mani Padme Hung when he said hello to people as a way of reinforcing that sense of shared potential. Can you think of examples of ways of doing that? And as I say, be gentle with yourself if you find that hard, because that's not an easy question to answer. I'll pop the questions in the chat. And we've got a fair chunk of time. So you've got like 15, um, 15, 20 minutes. Yes, you've got a little while.